Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. This afternoon we are joined by Mr. Alec Ross, a Democratic candidate for governor in the state of Maryland. My name is Shannon Coleman Siciliano. I serve as co-executive director of Strong Schools Maryland. We are a 501c3 organization, and our mission is to ensure that every public school student in the state of Maryland receives a world-class education. And so over the course of the next couple of weeks, we will be meeting with gubernatorial candidates and interviewing them live. And our focus will be on education and on the Kirwan Commission recommendations. And so we are not here to support any one particular party or candidate, but we do believe that whichever candidate is strongest in education and in support of the Kirwan recommendations will win the election.
That's right.
So no,
absolutely.
Yeah, so no pressure
From
here.
your lips to God's ears.
Okay. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And to kick things off, we're going to talk about policy first. And I'm going to start a little bit more broad, just starting with the Maryland State Constitution. So the Maryland State Constitution requires a thorough and efficient system of public education for our students. And what the court stated is that basically means that we're enabling students to meet state standards. And so what does that mean to you?
I think it means that every student has the opportunity to achieve in her or his classroom and school environment. And I think that that's not necessarily the case right now. I mean, for those of you who don't know already, I'm a former Baltimore City public school teacher. I taught in a classroom much like this one. It's getting started at room 308 in Booker T. Washington Middle School on the west side of Baltimore. And so what it means for me is that the resources available to all students in terms of instructional materials, in terms of educators, in terms of additional educational resources are sufficient to meet the standards. I think anybody who pays attention to these issues knows that this is not universally the case in the state of Maryland.
Thank you. And so the Kirwan Commission, they have developed a set of policies that essentially it's going to be a once-in-a-generation opportunity to ensure that we are educating our kids equitably and allowing them, to be prepared for careers and for education beyond high school. And so, thinking a little bit in the Kirwan policies that have been recommended, a lot of times when we think about looking at how the state is looking at education, we always think about the funding and how much money is going to be put into it. But the Kirwan Commission, they believe that what we spend our money on is just as important as how much.
I agree with that.
So thinking about the Kirwan policy recommendations, there are 5 policy areas that their recommendations fall under. So we have early childhood education, high quality teachers and leaders, college and career pathways and college and career readiness pathways, more resources for at-risk students, and governance and accountability. So of those 5 policy areas, we think that every recommendation that they are intertwined and they're interrelated. That you cannot take
you cannot segregate them. You can't say,
right.
Oh, I'm going to do college and career readiness, but not do high quality teachers and leaders. Like they have to work in concert.
Right, and we think that the next governor needs to fully support and implement all of the recommendations.
Well, lucky for you, the next governor is going to be me, and I do fully support them.
Okay, and so when you think about the policy areas, to think a little deeper, what 1 to 2 really stood out to you as being powerful or?
Well, I think they're all significant. One I would point to is more resources for at-risk students. For the last year, I've been traveling all over the state, spending lots of time in classrooms. And, look, I moved to Baltimore 24 years ago to be a public school teacher. My wife remains an educator in Baltimore City Public Schools. My 3 kids are all in Baltimore City Public Schools, so I never really left. But it's been fascinating to see the different quality of education and the different resource level across the state. And what's very clear to me is that the students who are most at risk, the students in whom we should be investing the most, are actually getting the least. This is true in Baltimore City. This is true in Prince George's County. This is true on much of the Eastern Shore in Southern Maryland. So things are flipped. In the highest income zip codes in Maryland, they are awash in resources. And this is a good thing. I do not find fault with those parts of the state that are actually doing it right. My question is how do we follow the examples set by Howard County, set by Montgomery County, set by, not all of Montgomery County, but parts of Montgomery County, where they are doing a better job of bringing resources to their at-risk students. So that's number one. Look, I mean, people say, oh, how are we going to deal with substance abuse? How are we going to deal with unemployment? How are we going to deal with homelessness? Well, if you don't actually invest in education for at-risk students, then you're going to have to deal with those problems later in life. There's one. Another one I would really focus in on is college and career readiness. You know, I got to be honest. I'm a Democrat. I'm running for the Democratic nomination for governor. But one area where I'm really critical of sort of the Democratic elite is over the last 20 to 30 years, I do believe it's been the case that a lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the words, and a lot of the policies of the Democratic elite have been, you go to college and you're a winner. You don't go to college and you're a loser. That's wrong. And we have this weird barbelled economy in Maryland where we have lots of knowledge workers. We have people who go to work wearing a white shirt and an orange tie or a lab coat. We have lots of knowledge workers. And then we have lots of people working at or around minimum wage. But we have a thin middle. You know, I saw one study that said the average age of a plumber in Maryland is 61. The average age of an electrician is 59. We have 20,000 openings in cybersecurity right now, the majority of which don't require a 4-year degree. So the second thing that really stands out to me as a point of passion and where I would want to do something immediately and fund it immediately and create a national standard is making sure that we have apprenticeships and a pathway into the skilled trades for people who aren't going to go to college. I think that these jobs in the skilled trades, they have dignity, they're very good paying, and we do a terrible job right now helping create a pathway for people from school into these good jobs for folks who aren't going to college. And this is true all 24 jurisdictions in Maryland. This is true in Appalachian Maryland, in the westernmost part of our state. It's true in inner city Baltimore. It's true in Prince George's County. It's true on the Eastern Shore.
So which policy area kind of gave you the most pause or made you think, you know, whether it was because of substance or because of funding implications that made you think?
There wasn't one, except the one thing that I would say is governance and accountability. I think you've got to sort of let's break that down. What do you mean? Everybody's in favor of good governance, and everybody's in favor of accountability. But what I want to see are what are the real policy recommendations that bear that out in a very concrete way. You know, what are the standards for how we audit our public schools and our public school systems? School systems will all say, oh, we're accountable right now. We have good governance right now. Is that true? Not so much. So I guess where I would like to see more difficult choices made is on the question of governance and accountability, because if we are going to be putting money into early childhood education, into college and career readiness, into more at-risk students, then we have to make sure that we are not just throwing money at the problem, and that there are the governance and accountability systems that are substantially advanced over where they are today to ensure that the money is spent very, very, very well.
Okay, and so I'm going to come back to accountability in a little bit to hear how you would hold systems accountable and as your role future governor. So the Strong Schools Maryland community and our members, they wrote in and they shared, you know, they had some concerns, and some of the things that they raised were around coordinated care, community schools, and additional support such as school counselors and nurses. But the Kerwin Commission specifically, they have a recommendation to expand community schools to ensure that there's enough funding for a full-time employee to operate the community school and for after-school programs. And this was basically it was a recommendation to help support concentrations of poverty.
Yes.
So my question to you is, as potential future governor of Maryland, What would you do to ensure that public schools are fully funded with the necessary staff and resources beyond the classroom that are essential for students' success in the classroom?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's seven Democratic candidates for governor, and I was the first one to come out with an education policy, and in that education policy, it clearly set out the answer to this question and drilled down specifically on community schools. Right now, the funding for education out of the budget in Maryland, it has slipped from 21% to 18% of the state budget. So a lot of these folks in Annapolis who are really good at sort of patting themselves on the back for what they're doing in education, no, not so much. Because what's actually happened is the percentage of our budget for education has gone down, 21 to 18%. I'm running to be Maryland's education governor. So I think that budgets are moral documents. You express your values through where you spend your money when you are in government. So first thing we got to do is we've got to stop the slide in the percentage of education funding that's been taking place with the current legislature and the current governor in Maryland. And what I would immediately seek to do is to get back north of 20%. In terms of the budget that's going to education. This would bring substantial resources in, and it would bring in the resources to make the kinds of investments that I think are necessary in community schools and in non-education based resources that we need. You mentioned counselors and nurses. We also need psychologists and social workers. So for every dollar you invest in counselors, psychologists, social workers, the return on investment, I believe, is substantial.
So I'm going to shift a little bit to equity. Equity remains a consistent focus for Strong Schools Maryland and for our members. And I have a question specifically related to that, but first, I just want to talk a little bit about where Maryland stands and what we are not doing for our students. We have districts and schools and administrators, teachers across our state who are doing their best to try to educate our students. But still, when we look at national and international benchmarks, Maryland is performing in the middle. So nationally, right. Maryland is performing in the middle, and the United States is performing in the middle. So if you look at where Maryland students are, we're internationally we're down towards the bottom.
Exact at an exact moment where we should be surging.
Right. And, and so this is true for all of Maryland students, regardless of where they live, regardless of race. Like, this is what's happening across the board. But then if we look at what's happening in districts and in schools, and we look at students, Black and brown students who have English as a second language, students with disability, and we see that we are definitely leaving those students behind. And so what we want, or what my question is to you is, if you were to become governor, what specific current policies do you think would most address the inequities that we see from the students that we are not serving in our state?
I think a lot of it goes to the funding formula. A lot of it goes to how are we going to allocate resources? And from an equity standpoint, we can sit around and we can talk about equality, but equality and equity are two different things. What equity to me means, it means resources that match the need. Not equal resources, but resources that match the need. And so from my standpoint, we need to look at the formula so that in very high need environments like in Baltimore City, where we know there are concentrations of poverty, where we know there are very high concentrations of people who are designated for special needs, and therefore the costs per student shoot way up. You have to account for that in the formula. And so what sometimes looks equal is not actually equal. Benjamin Disraeli, former Prime Minister of England, said there are three kinds of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. And if you just look at the data and things look, oh well, it's just it's above normal in terms of the amount of per pupil spending. Well, no, that's not actually true if you strip out some of the hard costs. So the one thing that I think is most necessary to achieve equity is to make sure that the resources actually match the need, as opposed to just trying to achieve quote unquote equality.
Okay. And so just, sticking with equity and to flag something that comes up time and time again is, focusing on students in concentrations of poverty or students in Baltimore City. But if we were to look at even students in Howard County, specifically Black and brown students in Howard County, if they're middle class and they're not living in poverty, we are still not serving those students. And so, we ask that the future governor, whomever he or she may be, look at all aspects of, equity and ensure that all students are getting what they need, specifically, students, as I said, Black and brown students, students with disabilities, students...
non-native English speakers.
Right.
Yeah, no, look, there's no question. I mean, students, in all 24 jurisdictions in Maryland, there is diversity within each of those 24 jurisdictions. There are jurisdictions that are more systematically disadvantaged than others. But within existing jurisdictions, too, there are populations that are served appropriate to the need, and there are students who are served in a way that is inappropriate to the need. And that oftentimes does break down based on race. It breaks down occasionally on gender. It very frequently breaks down on ethnicity, and it almost always breaks down when we're talking about students with special needs. Students with special needs, I think, need an extra measure of attention and investment if their needs are going to be met. The stigma that existed when I was growing up, and I'm old, I'm 46 years old, but when I was growing up, we thought of our special needs students as having very limited potential. And how do we get them from not being a quote-unquote burden on society? I think that's the wrong view. That's a deficit-based view of students with special needs and disabilities. Well, we should view them as we should view these students as having remarkable assets. They can and they will become very productive members of society if we help them get the educational resources and needs met, as they're growing up.
Okay. And so, we're counting on the future governor to support policy, and funding with that. So we're going to switch our gears for a minute to look at and discuss funding. And we talked about policy and the Kerwin Commission, what they spend their money on. The policy is just as important as how much. So we want to talk about, how much and your commitment to ensuring that Kerwin and education is funded in the state of Maryland. And so the full cost of the Kerwin recommendations has not been released. But
yeah, it's disappointing, actually.
So we're,
it's a little disappointing to me. I'm going to be honest with you. I mean, I play in politics with our kids a little bit. I'm not going to lie. I'm a little disappointed by that.
So from what we've heard is
I'm a parent. I'm a parent of 3 kids. I'm the wife of an educator. Sure would have been nice if they'd have met their deadline, but oh well.
Yep. So this fall they're going to release their funding proposal. But we know that the APA study said that Maryland schools need to fund an additional $2.9 billion in order to adequately educate our students. And so how would you plan to meet the funding requirements of the current recommendations?
Yeah, so as I said before, our budgets are moral documents. So if you look at the state budget right now, it's over $43 billion. And the percentage of the budget that is spent on education is substantially lower today than it was 5 years ago. I would take the dollars that we have and I would say, all right, we want to make these investments, these multi-billion-dollar investments in education. We're going to do that, period, full stop. There are ways of doing that. Again, another disaster of the current legislature is, they sort of lied to us when they said, oh, you can have casinos and the money from the casinos will go to the schools. Well, what did they do? They sort of played a fast one on us. The money from the casinos went to the schools, and what did they do? They just took a corresponding amount out of the general budget. So I would have the casino money and the lottery money become additive. It should supplement, not supplant, existing funding. And also, bluntly, all of these cutesy pie little programs that a lot of members of the legislature like, whether it's a lacrosse program in Baltimore County, whether it's this program, no, we've got to be more disciplined with our resources. And if what our top priority really is education, let's invest in that.
So the lockbox legislation passed, so that money, the casino money, is now secure. So should you become governor, and if the voters, in the state of Maryland support that, then
yeah. Unfortunately,
that money,
but it is an if.
Right.
It's an if. It's not a done deal yet.
Right.
So people have to vote in November to make that happen.
So if it does get voted and it happens, then that money would be there for you. And let's say you look at programs and you reallocate funds. Still, 2.9 billion is a lot of money. So additional revenue is going to have to be raised. And you may not be in the position now to commit to particular revenues, but we do know that we need a future governor that's going to commit. If they're going to commit to education, then they're going to have to make some commitments down the road to revenue. And so with that in mind, have you given any thought to particular revenue sources
Look,
for education?
I'm all in on this. For right now, we have $43.4 billion a year of revenue. $43.4 billion. We're talking about 2.9. You want to know who can't figure out how to find 2.9 billion out of 43.4 billion? Career politicians who have never run a business before, never had to understand a balance sheet before. So you know what? $43.4 billion worth of taxpayer resources, I would like my shot at figuring out how we can appropriately resource education. And this is not a hypothetical based on a theoretical based on a maybe. When I was in the Obama administration, when I joined the Obama administration, we went in the midst of a financial crisis. And what did we do? We figured out ways to stimulate the economy and to take billions of dollars of stupid cost out. That's my track record. I would love to have the opportunity to do that in Annapolis and with the Maryland state budget.
Okay, so one last question on that. So you think that reallocation is going to get the money, but you don't foresee potentially any additional revenue sources needed?
No, we're going to have additional revenue first as a byproduct of economic growth. So, every year the budget goes up steadily. And the question is, all right, if our revenues go up steadily every year, and the question is, as those revenues go up, are we going to spend them on career politicians' pet projects, or are we going to spend it on education? It's also going to go up because of the casino and lottery dollars. It's also going to go up because when I'm governor, we're going to legalize recreational marijuana. That's $800 million a year that we're now going to be able to tax and regulate. It's also going to go up because we're going to have an inclusive innovation agenda that is going to help us grow our economy and deregulate the segments of our economy that need to be deregulated. There's a huge amount of potential in Maryland. But what we have to do is we've got to get people who have the will and ability to invest first in education.
Okay, so you mentioned accountability in the beginning of our conversation, and so now here's your opportunity to share a little bit more about what you plan to do to hold districts and schools accountable to meeting our standards. So over time, Maryland, we've increased education funding, but we haven't seen the outcomes that we'd like to see. And so what specifically would be different should you become governor in the way governance and accountability works in the state?
I mean, so first, obviously, most of the responsibility for governance and accountability devolves from the state to the individual jurisdictions. Having said that, if we're going to invest in education in the way in which the Kerwin Commission recommends and in the way in which I want to, the question then becomes, all right, what's the conditionality? I mean, this can't just be sort of spraying dollar bills around and saying, all right, Kerwin Commission, woohoo, here's your money. No, I mean, there's got to be some real rigor here. So specifically on the question of governance and accountability, the ability to actually track how and where taxpayer dollars are spent on education, it's like you've got to be like Indiana Jones. I mean, it's an archaeological expedition to figure out how and where this money is being spent. Every single solitary dollar that should be spent, it should be open. There should be transparency. It should be machine readable, so that we're not surprised when it's January and it's freezing outside, and my son, who goes to Poly High School, has to wear a coat in the classroom, and we say, oh well, why can't you get the boilers fixed? Oh, it turns out we returned millions of dollars to the state. This is all a surprise to people because of the opacity in how we spend money. And so I think that bringing hyper transparency to where the money is, how it's being spent, how it's not being spent, would be a good start. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, and I think we need to disinfect a lot of our accounting systems in public schools in Maryland.
Okay. And so what would you do as governor? How would we know that implementing the Kerwin recommendations are your top priority? How would we know from a funding perspective?
I'm not sure I understand it.
So
I'm running to be Maryland's education governor. I am fully committed to the recommendations of the Kerwin Commission. I look forward to their coming back with the data about what the costs are. Obviously, it would be a priority of mine, but when you say, how do you know?
Well,
take a
every
blood
year,
oath?
yes. So every year, the governor proposes a budget.
Right.
So in essence, how would we know that in your budget that Kerwin is your top priority?
What you would see is a budget, and you would see the percentage spent on education going from where it is now, and see it go like that. So
Okay.
right now we're at 18%. Seeing it go north of 20% would be necessary, and seeing also where it's going. So the Kerwin Commission set out very specific recommendations about where they believed the allocation of capital should be. So not only would you see the budget go up, but you would see it allocated toward line items like early childhood education and others that line up with the recommendations of the Commission.
Okay. So our last set of questions, it's more so around your vision. And should you become governor of Maryland at the end of the your 4-year term, how would we know that we were successful and that we got students to achieve, what we sought out to have them achieve?
So after 4 years, and first we have to be open-eyed about nobody is going to solve every problem in public education in Maryland in 4 years. The problems we have are generations in the making, and what we need now is a generation-long commitment to really invest in education. It shouldn't just be based on one term of a governor or 2 terms of a governor. This should be a multi-decade commitment to ensuring equity in education in Maryland. After 4 years, what would I hope you would see? First of all, I would hope you would see that by the end of 4 years, we would have America's best apprenticeship programs in place to create a pathway for people into good jobs who aren't going to go to college. Thing 2 we would see is I would like to think that we would see real equity for students with special needs. And we would begin to see the impact of resources going into historically disadvantaged communities. My wife is an educator in Baltimore City Public Schools right now. The resources in her classrooms are largely resources that she brings. I would hope that by the end of the first year, that's not something that she would be thinking of anymore. Right now, my son goes to Poly High School, and the science labs there, they have some resources, but they're hardly the kind of abundant resources that you see in more privileged educational environments. So I would like to see the almost visible. You should be able to see the changes in terms of access to resources.
Okay. And last question is there anything else that the Strong Schools Maryland community or those tuning in should know about your commitment to Kerwin and education?
Yeah, I mean, it's really simple. I'm a former Baltimore City Public School teacher, married to a Baltimore City Public School teacher with 3 kids in Baltimore City Public Schools. For me, the commitment to education isn't political. It isn't, intellectual. It's rooted in my personal experience. It's rooted in my family and what they do all day, every day. I'm running to become Maryland's education governor. There's no other person running for governor who's ever been a teacher in a public school, much less a public school in Maryland, much less a public school in Baltimore. And I think to really understand some of the needs is you have to have at least spent time inside some of these classrooms, and that's the perspective that I bring.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and thank you for tuning in. If you'd like any more information about Strong Schools Maryland, please visit our website, www.strongschoolsmaryland.org. Thank you.